psychology program that's starting in the winter. So we're all
I'm
very
very
excited
glad
to
to
have
know
that.
that.
So we are now live and everybody can hear us. So I'm going to go ahead and share the screen,
Okay,
get our clock ready for the drum roll up to the top of the hour.
thank you.
You're welcome.
One of our viewers designed this as an animated version. You'll see it when she starts the clock of the rainbow yin yang.
Mm. No, it's
Logo.
really nice.
The colors change as it rotates.
No, very cool. Yeah, and
Yeah.
I saw you both have the logo as a necklace and as a pin. So
I should
I
send
felt
you
like
a few
yeah, I was
of
like,
these.
where's mine? I want to wear one.
Okay, no, I'll be very happy to send some to you.
That's great. Yeah, it's really cool.
Thank you. This one is actually a pin on a chain. It's the
Oh,
chain is large enough, so I just pin it to so that
oh
works
yeah,
pretty well. So I don't get a hole in my nice blouse.
right.
All right, we can go ahead and start this. Here
Oh
we go.
yeah.
So now we hypnotize you and the audience in a good way.
Well, yeah, what happens at this point is that YouTube will send out announcements to those of our subscribers who agree to receive announcements,
Mm.
which I think is about 15,000 people.
No, amazing.
And they will be logging in now. So that by the time we start in 10 minutes, we'll have a good size audience.
Yeah. Yeah, wonderful.
And we have wonderful moderators helping us today. We have Pablo, Celia, Elizabeth. Thank you for being with us, supporting us,
Mhm.
and bringing questions over for Sean from the live chat for us to select, for Jeff and I to select and ask him.
So, Sean, are you planning to make any visits to the CIHS campus?
Yeah, the students in my program, we've been meeting and trying to figure out when we could have a kind of in-person retreat for like 3 or 4 days. And so we did a survey recently to kind of figure out, what would be the best time for folks. And at this point, it looks like we're going to have that in mid-September, this, next year, and connect it to the CIHS graduation. So
Ah,
that we'll arrive, like 4 days ahead of the graduation. We'll have a program event, of kind of a retreat of sorts, some meditation, some classes, some hangout time, and then we'll kind of join the rest of the CIHS community for the graduation on that Saturday. So yeah, I'm excited to do that and connect with people in person because we've been an online program for 2 years and we've never had an in-person event. So this will be a great opportunity for people to connect with each other who are become good friends or during the course of the program, but have never shared physical space together yet.
because as I understand it, everything was on campus before COVID, I imagine. And then
Exactly. Yeah. And
everything became online, and gradually people began to realize the many benefits of online education.
yeah.
And but the campus still exists. So the
Yeah.
question is, how do you utilize both resources?
Yeah. Yeah, it was like kind of the toothpaste was out of the bottle. So once the students in the programs went online and we accepted students who were living in different states and different countries, then to, expect them to move to, the San Diego area, as beautiful as it is, it's kind of out of the question. So then it's like it became an online program kind of by default because we had admitted students, from all over the world. But, for some international students that, want to live in the US, they have to take a certain number of classes on campus. So we do offer a few on-campus courses each year as part of that requirement. And we do live workshops and public programs on campus. And we've also partnered with Soul of Yoga, who is part of our yoga certification therapy program with the Integral Health Department. And they rent out some of the space and use it for some of their trainings. So yeah, we're still kind of figuring out all the best ways to utilize the campus. One of the areas that I'm really keen on is we have a research lab there. We have, a lot of equipment to study subtle energies and to study consciousness. We have EEG machines, we have heart rate variability machines, and many other fancy equipment. And so one of the things students in my program are trying to figure out is which items can be checked out and that, can be mailed to students. Which ones do we have to have students travel to the campus to use it, with people that are going to be part of their research for their dissertation. So yeah, because we have the largest Faraday cage on the West Coast there on campus, as part of that research facility.
Yeah, so especially for any students who are considering laboratory work, that's essential.
Yeah, and with us bringing on the parapsychology concentration, in the winter, we really want to be able to provide, laboratory resources for people who are getting, a degree in parapsychology to actually conduct, different kinds of parapsychological research. So, I think we're really headed towards, investing time, energy into the lab facilities and figuring out how to do that kind of in an online context, right? Or partnering with other labs and research facilities, around the U.S. that can allow students to utilize their facilities.
Mm-hmm. But a Faraday cage would be very useful for
Yeah,
parapsychology work.
yeah, for sure. Yeah.
In fact, I'm inclined to think that one of the reasons that all the original remote viewing at SRI was so successful is they had this really well-built radio shielded room
Mm.
that they did the research in.
Yeah. No, it seems like that was a big factor.
You know.
For those who are listening who may not know what a Faraday cage is, could either of you describe what it is?
Jeffrey,
Sean, I can. I'm happy to do it. It's basically you can easily build a Faraday cage by in effect, it's a box with a copper screen on all sides, and the copper screen prevents stray radio signals, electromagnetic signals of any kind from entering the inside of the cage. So it's in effect, it's shielded from all of that. The thing is that I know in parapsychology research, there are all sorts of subtleties about the nature of the shielding and whether you run any electric currents through the shielding, and if you do, what kind are they pulsed and so on. And there's been some research going back to the 1950s that Charlie Tart did that showed that certain particular configurations of a Faraday cage are very effective in enhancing ESP scores. And the thinking is that it has something to do with the idea that all of the enormous amount of radio and television signals that are passing through our bodies all the time creates a certain amount of noise in the nervous system, and that individuals inside the cage are shielded from all of that electromagnetic noise, and therefore their psychic functioning works more smoothly.
Isn't it also designed to show that psychic functioning is not there, that it's not really like maybe a wave, but it's somehow about that interconnectedness that we're all a part of?
Well, that's a separate question, I would say.
Okay.
It's an interesting question whether there's some sort of signal,
right,
or not. I'm inclined to think, as you just pointed out, that psychic functioning is not dependent on any signal, because they've never found a signal. They've never found an organ to receive such a signal. It's more likely a question of consciousness itself being basically everywhere.
A field opposed to a signal.
Yeah.
Okay, we're about to start in just a few seconds. Welcome, everybody. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. I'm here with the co-host of New Thinking Aloud, Emmy Vadnais, and our special guest for today's live stream event, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens. Sean is the director of the Noetic Sciences program at the California Institute for Human Science. He is focusing on non-human intelligence and also super experiencers. Those are topics that we've discussed in 2 previous interviews with Sean on New Thinking Aloud. And today he'll be here to answer any questions that viewers pose on the YouTube chat window. We have volunteers who will collect the best of those questions and submit them to Emmy and I, and we will pose them to you, Sean. But to begin with, Sean, perhaps you'd like to make an opening statement to let our viewers know a little more about your main focus.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Jeffrey and Emmy. Great to be here, and welcome all the listeners. I'm excited to dive in and engage your questions and create a conversation exploring the nature of consciousness and what it has to reveal about reality. So let me just introduce myself a little bit, talk about the program that I'm involved in, because that's the context out of which the super experiencer research is occurring. And then I'll say a little bit about the super experiencer research, and then just a couple things about non-human intelligences. And then we'll just open it up and kind of see where the conversation takes us today. So I live in Maine with my wife and 2 teenage daughters. We have 3 pugs, and when there are 2 or more pugs together, it's called a grumble. So we have a grumble, and 2 cats. So very, very dynamic household. I spend a lot of time out in the wilds of Maine, kayaking to the islands and hiking and mountain biking and cross-country skiing. I'm an executive coach and business consultant. That's one of kind of the professional day jobs hats that I wear. And then the other one, as Jeffrey mentioned, is I'm an academic and researcher based at the California Institute for Human Science, which is in Encinitas, California. And there I run an online accredited graduate program that offers master's and PhDs in integral noetic sciences, right? And so INS, as the acronym there. So INS is the scientific study of the relationship between consciousness and reality through the use of integral mixed methods with a focus on anomalous and noetic experiences, right? So that's what I do in the context of this program. And so essentially we are asking the big questions, right? What happens after death? Is there a God? You know, the nature of consciousness and reality. And so we explore kind of everything weird and mystical. So, you know, which is, to me, like, that's where all the outlier data points are that you want to be aware of to try and, you know, figure out these big questions. So the program focuses on a number of different areas, right? So there's kind of integral and transdisciplinary maps, models, and frameworks that we kind of use a lot. Esoteric and contemplative science. We have 2 labs on campus. Jeffrey and I were just talking about that, and that's why we're talking about the Faraday cage. And so that lab on campus, allows us to study subtle energies and allows us to study consciousness. We focus a lot in the program on philosophy of science, quantum theory, feminist and post-colonial critiques of science. And we look at the global religious and spiritual traditions, the magical traditions, the esoteric traditions, the contemplative traditions, and and the indigenous traditions. And we look at transpersonal psychology and philosophy of mind, the neuroscience of meditation, and so forth. We have a number of concentrations, and the super experiencer research kind of grew out of these concentrations. So students can focus on wisdom design, anomalous studies, UAP and conscious studies, and we just added a new area, psychedelic studies. And so, students use this degree in the context of research, education, organizational leadership, coaching, and consulting. So this last spring, so that kind of gives you the context of the graduate, program where this research is coming out of. So last spring, a group of 12 graduate students and I launched what we refer to now as the Worldwide Initiative for Super Experiencer Research. And the acronym for that is WISER. And our hope is that the world's going to be a wiser place as a result of us doing this research. So it's always good when you have kind of a sticky acronym, to go along with, a really long name of a research project. So we spent the spring quarter kind of laying the foundations for this 6+ year project, focusing on identifying kind of the main buckets of noetic and anomalous experience, and then coming up with 25 to 30 questions for each category. And you can actually check out our pilot survey, which we launched this last summer, and you can even take it, whether you think you're a super experiencer or not. And so you can go to www.superexperiencer.org, all one word, and it only takes 10 to 15 minutes to fill out. And just having it up for a few months, we already have 150 people having filled it out. And it's just incredible to see the descriptions people are providing of all the, weird and amazing experiences that they've had. And we'll, be getting into that today. So you ask yourself, well, what is a super experiencer? Well, it's normal people like you and me who have had multiple types of anomalous and noetic experiences throughout their life. So the 10 categories that my team has come up with, scouring the literature, reflecting on our own experiences, talking with people who have these experiences, we come up with 10 major kind of categories or buckets, and they are the following: out-of-bodies experiences, near-death experiences, psychic experiences, psychedelic experiences, non-human intelligence encounters, noetic dreams, paranormal experiences, UAP events or encounters, and permeable self experiences. And we just recently added this 10th category after I dove into the work of Robert Faulkner and his stuff on the Others Within Us, which is quite amazing. And I know he's been a guest here, and I really love Bob and what he's doing. And it really helped me realize that this was a 10th category that we really needed to include as a distinct category. So we're using this pilot survey to kind of pressure test these buckets. And obviously, there's a lot of overlap between these categories. A single experience that someone has could, in many cases, go in 2 or 3 or even 4 of them. So it's not like we're trying to dissect it all, but we're trying to identify, like, what are the major types and categories and labels of these anomalous and noetic experiences that people have. I myself have had experiences that fall into 6 to 7 of these, buckets, if you will. So for me, one of the most interesting aspects of all of these are the entity encounters, right? So the encounters with non-human intelligences. And Jeffrey and I had a great conversation about that, as well as the super experiencer piece. So today we're kind of like bringing together the 2 different interviews that I've done with you, Jeffrey, and then engaging the community around these topics, which is super exciting. So entities, like, people report encountering all kinds of beings and entities, and kind of what just it's amazing to to see the range. This includes everything like from fairies and nature intelligences to angels and demons, extraterrestrials, cryptids, Sasquatch, dogmen, thought forms and egregores, ghosts, and what I refer to as either metahumans or alternate human intelligences. Because interestingly, a lot of strange beings that people encounter basically look like humans, but they sense that they're not exactly like you and me. Like there's something a little different about them, and they can't always put their finger on it, but it's kind of like they look like a human, but they kind of feel like maybe they're not, and so there's a lot of different possibilities there. And so this research project is interested in kind of exploring these 10 major kind of types of experiences. And I'm particularly interested in the encounters for non-human intelligences. And so that's kind of one facet of the research. So we're dividing the research project into 3 phases. Each phase takes between 18 and 24 months, so basically a year and a half to 2 years. So it's at least 6 years. I likely will continue beyond that. But so phase 1 is doing a global survey and aiming towards getting several thousand people to fill out our survey. We've just launched the pilot survey, as I mentioned. We're going to launch the formal full survey in early next year. And then phase 2 is then selecting out of that group of people 100 plus in-depth interviews, right? So to really kind of go into really detailed descriptions of these experiences with 100 or more individuals, and have a series of questions to just try and better understand many aspects of those experiences. And then the third phase is kind of taking 50 people that we did interviews with, and then doing brain imaging, subtle energy research, and trying to understand kind of the biology and the genetics that might be part of this, and doing brain scans and so forth. And you can see on our little micro page, the superexperiencer.org site, we have over 24 internationally recognized advisors. So we have a great team in place of folks who are part of this and helping us, and so it's great to have all of that support. And we're in the process of hiring a research assistant, one of the students in the program, and we're going to run another what I call the Anomalous research practicum in spring, where the graduate students work with me on kind of the next part of the research project. So here's the last thing, and then we're going to open it up. These are some of the questions that we're wanting to explore by doing this research. So how common are super experiencers and these kinds of experiences? So we're interested in does this happen a lot? Is this just a small select group of people? Is it much more common than we might realize? And what is the range of experiences that people have? Do people tend to have just 1 or 2 or 3 of these kinds of experiences, or do they tend to have 4 or 5 or 6? Or are there a lot of people who are having 7, 8, 9, 10 different types of experiences? So we're kind of wanting to understand better that range. And then are there certain patterns that link certain kinds of experiences, right? Do some experiences tend to follow other kinds of experiences? So do we see near-death experiences preceding certain types of other experiences, right? Or do we see out-of-body experiences serving as kind of a catalyst that then people start to have more psychic experiences, but we can tell in their biography that they're kind of the first big anomalous experience they had was out of body, and then in the years subsequent that they started having these other experiences, right? So we're wanting to kind of explore those things. And then when do these experiences start in people's lives? Like when they're young, when they're, in college, when they're adults, right? And, how long are the phases that people have when they have these experiences? Because many people so far have reported that there'll be like a 2 or 3 year, 4 year period where they have a lot of these things happening. And then it kind of dies down for many years, even a decade. And then it kind of kicks back up, right? So we're wanting to understand those phases of super experiences. And then what makes these experiences available to people? Is it their innate talent, acquired skills like through meditation, trauma of different sorts, or just kind of grace? And are there family patterns that go with these experiences? Like do, brothers, sisters, mom, dads, kids, show these experiences as well? And then one area that I'm super interested in is what's the relationship between people's subtle bodies and these experiences? Because one of the hypotheses I have is that, and I kind of alluded to it just a few moments ago, that a lot of people seem to have what I would call a separation event, at an out of body experience that like differentiates their subtle body from their physical body. And then that seems to make them more open to these kinds of experiences. So I'm wanting to, study that more closely. And then which categories tend to overlap more than others? And what types of entities are most common with which kinds of experiences? And because sometimes people will have a UFO encounter and ET encounters, but then they'll experience ghost, like a dead person on the ship, right? So it's kind of like, okay, why are ghosts showing up on the UFO craft? So wanting to understand like kind of which entities are associated with which kinds of experiences and what might that indicate. And then, how do these experiences impact and transform people's lives, change their worldview? And then ultimately, all of this is aimed at, can we get a better understanding of the relationship between consciousness and reality? So let's open it up to questions about super experiencers in general, as well as the research project or, even the INS program if people have questions about that. And I would love to hear from people about your own anomalous and noetic experiences, because that's always the most interesting part of these conversations. So I really welcome you all to share your own experiences to whatever extent you're comfortable. So let's dive in.
We have a question we have many questions coming in already. And the first one I'd like to select is from Paul Leslie, who has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud and is also one of the instructors in the new parapsychology graduate degree programs at the California Institute for Human Science. Paul will be teaching the module on clinical parapsychology.
Oh, great. No.
Asked Sean, what has been the biggest challenges you have faced in creating a meta-discipline of the magnitude of exo studies?
No, great. Thanks, Paul. That's a great question. And welcome to the team. I'm super excited to have you as part of the CIHS faculty and offering this new program in parapsychology. So I look forward to connecting with you more in the near future. Yeah, the metadisciplinary approach to exo studies. My background is studying Ken Wilber's, integral theory and other similar kind of big picture integrative map makers. And so I've always had an orientation to kind of interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary approaches, and just really recognize that, especially when we're studying the anomalous and noetic realities, we really need all kinds of disciplines to weigh in, right? We need to hear from the social sciences, the behavioral sciences, the arts and humanities, the systems thinkers. It's like we really kind of need all hands on deck. I think one of the biggest challenges is that people who are experts in their respective fields generally only speak that language. And so it's hard to find maps and models that translate across these different categories of disciplinary knowledge, right? And people just don't have the time and energy to kind of learn those other languages. And so kind of like, what's the meta framework or language that can kind of help, connect the dots? So that's a challenge. I think also we don't have a good sense of agreement of like what's real. like everyone has very different ideas of like kind of what constitutes real or validated or documented, and so there's a lot of different criteria and frameworks that people will point to, often associated understandably with their area of expertise. So I think, and this is why I like kind of Wilber's broad empiricism, right? That there's kind of these three elements. There is doing the injunction, like looking through the microscope, looking through, statistical analysis. So there's, doing the practice, sitting on the meditation cushion. So there's doing the injunction. Then there's the data that is generated from that. And then only people who have also done that practice and generated data are then part of the community of the adequate, and they're able to then kind of weigh in on the validity of, you know, that data that emerges from doing that practice. So this kind of broad empirical approach applies equally to, you know, kind of standard, you know, classical empiricism as it does, you know, meditative experience. So I think finding the right kind of integral and meta frameworks that kind of allow everyone who has a seat at the table to actually understand and appreciate and learn from each other. But I think in many ways that's becoming easier. I think more people are realizing that we do need these meta frames, you know, to try and make sense of the complexity of what we're, you know, discovering reality holds. So I'll leave it at that for now. But thanks, Paul. It's a great question.
Yes, and I just also want to say hello to Paul. I've had the pleasure of also interviewing him on New Thinking Aloud, and I'm super excited for all that's happening at CIHS. And we have a question, although we'll see how you respond, because you're suggesting that your research is just getting going, or have you? Yeah, so, well, his question is, and we'll see, because I know Jeff has been in this field for a number of years, and between the two of you, we'll probably get a nice response. His name is Pablo. Thank you for helping out today, Pablo, a volunteer with us. And he asks, in your opinion, or based on your research, what are the triggers or initial experiences for super experiencers? And then you already described the spectrum. He asked about that, the different kinds. And what's between a single experiencer and a super experiencer, which I think you kind of described, but if you could share what comes to mind from that question. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Great. Thanks, Pablo. Yeah. So I'll start with that last piece. You know, a regular experiencer would be, you know, someone who just has, you know, one or just a couple anomalous experiences throughout their life. So maybe when, you know, they're in college, they have, you know, a couple powerful precognitive dreams, you know, during their college years. And then they don't really have anything else. And then maybe, you know, 20, 30 years later, you know, they have an experience of a ghost in their house, you know, and so they've had a couple anomalous experiences, or maybe they have a powerful unitive experience during the meditation retreat, you know, so they've had a few, but they're not super regular. There's not a wide range of them. Whereas a super experiencer would be someone who has 5 or more of the categories that I outlined earlier, and they have those on a semi-regular basis, right? But they might have certain kinds of experiences occurring at different phases of their life. So maybe when they were younger, they had initially a near-death experience, and then after that, they were able to see dead people around them, and then they developed some psychic experiences and capacities, and then maybe that shut down during their college years, and then, you know, in their mid 30s, it kind of opened up again. And then maybe they started having some UFO encounters, and then they started having some channeling experiences that seemed to be connected to that, but it wasn't clear what the connection was. But the time frame seemed to kind of, you know, somehow indicate there was some kind of link there. And, you know, and so super experiencer, and you're right, like the line is not always clear. I mean, obviously people who have had 0 experiences, and then there's those who've maybe just had a couple here and there. And so part of the research is to kind of try and figure out, where should we draw that line? Is it when people have had 3 or more experiences? Is it someone who's had 8 or more experiences? Right now, I'm kind of loosely considering it's like, you know, somewhere between, you know, 3 and 5 different kinds of experiences on a semi-regular. And again, like, what do we mean by semi-regular? Like, that's what we kind of want to see what the data suggests, right? Just to get a baseline of like what seems common and what seems uncommon. But I will say this, so far already, just with the 150 people who have, you know, filled out the pilot survey, and also just my informal conversations with people, I have the sense that many more of us are super experiencers than I even imagined was the case, right? And I think part of that is there's just this social taboo around. We don't talk about these things. And you might acknowledge, like, oh yeah, I had a weird dream, or yeah, I thought I saw a ghost once. And then you just kind of leave it at that. But then you've actually had a lifetime of these kind of anomalous experiences. And for myself, you know, and this just kind of underscores the point. I thought, well, I'm not a super experiencer. I mean, I'm interested in studying super experiencers. But then at one point I looked at the 10 categories. I was like going through, like, okay, have I had that? Oh, yeah, okay, that. And like I said in my opening comments, I've had 6 or 7, you know, experiences or multiple experiences that fall into 6 or 7 categories. So even I was reluctant to kind of realize that, you know, I think maybe depending on how we define it, I too might be a super experiencer, but I don't think of myself as a super experiencer. So I think that's part of what's exciting about, this project is kind of trying to figure some of that out, help normalize conversations around this so people feel more free to share the range of experiences they have. And Emmy, you're going to have to tell me, I know I answered some of Pablo's questions. Is there any part that I didn't get to? I think maybe the first part,
What are
haven't
triggers?
responded.
What are
Oh,
what are
triggers. Yeah.
which you've mentioned a little
Thank
bit
you.
early, but
Yeah.
Jeff, I would imagine you've seen some patterns there.
Yeah. Jeffrey, you want to start with that and then I can build on what you share?
Well, of course, I think from a research point of view, one of the major triggers for people having spontaneous, subjective psychic experiences, sad to say, is having had a traumatic childhood.
Yeah.
Right. And that
Yeah.
kind of goes back to Sean, what you were saying about if a person has a really upsetting experience where they seem to kind of shift their consciousness out of maybe their body, or something expands perhaps, or what is
Yeah.
happening there.
Yeah, and Jeff Kripal has written a lot and talked a lot about kind of this interesting link between trauma and transcendence, and that they often seem to go together. And as Jeffrey Mishlove just said, if someone's had, traumatic childhood, sexual, emotional, physical, psychological abuse, those types of trauma can be a trigger because people often will disassociate, go out of body, differentiate their subtle body as kind of a natural defense mechanism for managing that situation. So that seems to be a precursor. Other kinds of trauma could be an accident, like a near-death drowning, a car accident, falling off your bike and getting knocked unconscious. It might not result in a full near-death experience, but it could be a kind of trauma that, maybe there's an out-of-body separation, that maybe doesn't qualify, as a classical NDE, but is something kind of, in that kind of trajectory. Getting really sick, getting really bad food poisoning, or like a medical emergency, or flatlining on, the table. Again, it might end up in an NDE, or it might just be, a little bit shy of that. And then, interestingly, and this is one area that I've been focusing on more and more in the last year or so, is meditative practice. And it's interesting that, like, if you just look at Buddhist practice, most Western Buddhist practitioners are not aware of this, because our Western approach to Buddhism kind of sanitizes out the cities or the magical powers and these elements, and we kind of de-emphasize it. But there's a lot in the Buddhist tradition that acknowledges if you do meditation, different kinds of meditations on a regular basis, you're going to start having these experiences. And often you're told to ignore them and they're a distraction. But there are certain groups within Buddhism that, work with those experiences kind of more directly, and they are part of the path in some respects. Daniel Ingram has brought a lot of attention to, kind of embracing these experiences. Di Otto has just came out with a book called Paranormal States that, looks at Western Buddhists who report these experiences, all 10 of the kind of experiences I'm researching. And they're often kind of confused because they're sitting there doing their meditation and they have these experiences. And then they go to their teacher and the teacher's like, oh, yeah, just ignore that. And they're like, I don't know that I can ignore that, right? Or I don't know if I want to ignore that, right? And this is kind of Jeff Kripal's whole point. These are part of our superhumanity, right? These just seem to be part of what it means to be embodied as human beings, like these skills, capacities, experiences. And they point to the fact that we live in a much more dynamic, multidimensional, mysterious cosmos than our current kind of cosmology tends to allow for, right? So for me, part of focusing on these experiences and these cities and these, is kind of reclaiming the enchantment of this cosmos that we live in, and what a mysterious, amazing place it is.
Yeah, it begs the question, what is normal and
Yeah.
what is even super or super
Right,
normal
right.
versus, I mean, maybe your research will show that this is more common than maybe we thought among people.
Yeah. Yeah, and maybe we just have to get rid of the super and just talk about experiencers, because most experiencers are super experiencers and vice versa, right?
So if you're opening up your research to whomever, just anybody who would like to participate, do you do like a sample of kind of the general public, or how do you sort of well, it sounds like you're studying super experiencers versus the general public and kind of seeing how frequent that happens to people, if my question makes sense.
Yeah, so I think, the phase one, which is the global survey, is going to be, self-selective, right? So people who are interested in this,
Mhm.
people who have probably had a few experiences that, may or may not qualify ultimately as super experience or whatever that officially ends up being, they're the ones that are going to be interested in filling out the pilot survey and then doing the full survey when it's available. Then we're going to go through all of those, filled out forms, and we're going to select, 100 plus people that we want to do in-depth interviews. And we're part of what we're going to do in the spring as a research team is start to identify the criteria by which we would select those interviewees. And then the people that are selected and agree to do it, there are going to be, probably 6 to 10 psychometric assessments that they would go through that kind of serves as, kind of just, determining normalcy in a sense. These are just standard psychometric assessments that people use in all kinds of similar psychological and anomalous experience research. But it helps us get the baseline. It helps us basically say, these are just average normal people like everyone else. There are not, mental health issues. There's not, other red flags. And that then we do an in-depth interview with them, and then they, are part of phase two, right? So in that sense, phase one is just open to anyone who wants to do it. Phase two will start to be a narrowing down, and there'll be certain qualities and capacities and criteria by which we'll use to select, a subgroup, that really helps us support having a kind of a valid, subsample to work with, so that the results of this can really be taken seriously.
I know it's Jeff's turn to ask a question, but if I may, Jeff, there's Brian Lakowski asked, since we're on the topic of your study, you've mentioned some of this here, but if there's any more you can share about this, he asks, how are you designing your controls for this study?
Yeah, so that's why I have such a big advisory group. It's like, because right now with phase one, the survey, there's not as much of a need for the controls, right? Because like I just said, it's just open to the public. Anyone can self-select into it, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, you're going to get a wide range, right? And, one of the critiques of that is just there's no controls, right? It's like anyone can do it. But then that's why with phase two, there are going to be criteria. We're going to be looking at the different kinds of selective process and and how to, really, have those controls. And then the psychometric assessments that people do, that's generally the controls for that phase. And then there might be some winnowing down of participants based on, that. And then for the third phase, which is kind of the neuroimaging phase and kind of the biomedical phase, we're going to need even more controls. And, that's like 4 years down the road. So I haven't even given that much thought, but again, that's why I've surrounded myself with people who are a lot smarter than I am, so that, people who have been doing this kind of research for years and are pioneers in different topics, so that I can really get support around clarifying those elements and really produce, rigorous methodological research that really, can make an impact on the conversation we're having around this. Right. So part of it is, there's my learning curve and becoming a researcher in some of these areas that I'm less familiar with and the kind of methods, and giving me myself enough time to kind of, learn and figure it out and talk with the advisors to get that support. But yeah, so we kind of, the first phase is the easiest. The second phase is harder. Third phase is kind of the most intense around, the research methodological requirements. So we have some time to get there.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Here's a question from Professor J. Paul de Vierville.
Oh, Jay Paul, yes, a good friend. Hey, Jay.
He asks, what role does the sacred play in, around, and through integral noetic sciences.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Jay Paul. Great to have you with us today. Well, for me, kind of the sacred is where it's all at, right? Integral noetic science is, as I mentioned in the beginning, is, it's really looking at the interface between consciousness and reality. And, so much of what we focus on in the program are, the different global religious traditions, the contemplative traditions, the indigenous, the esoteric, the magical traditions, because all of those are different approaches to the sacred. And, but we also have science. We have a lot of science, kind of new, progressive, holistic forms of science, transpersonal forms of science. And a lot of those approaches to science that we include in the INS program really try and integrate the sacred into the scientific, project in many ways. So, because we're not interested in, the standard, reductionistic, materialist, forms of science. I mean, the methods are great, and we want to build on those methods. But in terms of kind of the meta narrative there, the kind of global worldview, because I think, and this is why I'm doing the super experiencer research, because as you know, Jay Paul, I have this notion of that we live in a wild cosmos, right? And a wild cosmos is like this amazing, mysterious place where there's all kinds of intelligences, there's all kinds of interconnected, ways in which we're, part of this larger fabric of sacredness. And so for me, the super experiencer research is kind of one way that I'm trying to help resacralize our cosmology, resacralize our understanding of reality by, highlighting that all kinds of normal average people are having these anomalous and noetic experiences. And it's something that we've lost sight of. We've lost touch with, that we ourselves are having these experiences, the people around us are having these experiences. And we actually live in a sacred cosmos, where a lot more is possible than we often or realize or kind of, connected to. So to me, I think the sacred is really the foundation of all of it in one way or another. So I'm glad that you asked that to kind of help kind of forefront that aspect of the program and this research that we're talking about today.
Here's a question from Alan Steinfeld, who has been a guest on New Thinking Aloud a couple times.
Yeah. Hey, Alan.
Alan, thanks for joining us. And he asks, is there any work in categorizing the landscape or dimensional consciousness realms where each experience takes place, and any work concerning brainwave states with different experiences? I kind of threw two in there for you, both from Alan.
Yeah. So, it's interesting that for a long time, there was a lot of research on meditators, right, and brain states and EEGs, and but it's interesting that since then, there's been research on channelers and their brain states while they're channeling. There's more and more research that's available that shows different kinds of brain states associated with different types of anomalous experiences. People doing DMT, psychedelic experiences. So there's kind of a little mini explosion of more and more research that's exploring what's happening in the brain during more and more different types of noetic and anomalous experiences. And that's, one of the things that, I'm most interested in with this research. And I'm kind of excited that phase 3 is, basically 4 years out, because I suspect there's going to be some great stuff published in the next few years, kind of, addressing this topic and your question, so that we can be even more informed by, recent published, articles on, different anomalous experiences and brain states, so that when we get to that phase and we're looking at the 50 plus interviewees that we've worked with, and we're deciding, how do we want to approach the brain state, kind of research part of it, how are we going to do that? Are we going to focus on the different kinds of experiences that people have had and the brain states associated with it? And so to me, that's one of the more interesting, kind of future parts of the research. Because like with the channeling, material, one thing that was really striking with the research is it basically shows that the part of the brain associated with the personality shuts down, and it's kind of this higher order part of the brain that's involved with the channeling. And so what that suggests is that, contra the skeptics, who generally think, oh, well, the person's just tapping into their unconscious, right, or their subpersonalities, and they're just kind of channeling themselves. Well, the brainwave research on channeling suggests the opposite, right? It actually suggests what the channelers themselves are saying is more likely the case, right? That they're tapping into something kind of bigger than themselves, right? So I think that's where this kind of brain research can be very interesting because it can help us fine tune the kind of research questions we want to ask, to both validate some of this material or just, kind of realize kind of what aspects are true, what aspects are maybe less true, and develop new frameworks of explanation around this. And did I respond to the first part of that question?
I think so.
Okay. All right. Just want to make sure because it was kind of a double combo. So,
Well, yeah, let me go back to it. So he was asking about categorizing the landscape or dimensional consciousness realms where each experience takes place, which is,
okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
that's a really great question, of course, Alan. So,
Right. So, I teach a couple courses in the INS program that basically look at subtle worlds, subtle realms, psychedelic worlds, like kind of where do we go when we go out of body or have an NDE, or a psychedelic experience? Like, are we going to the same place, right? Or are we going to different worlds and realms? And kind of what's the cosmology that can kind of hold all of that? So I'm very interested in that, and I'm very familiar with the literature around that. One of the working models I have is that different experiences that people have actually involve different subtle bodies. And there's different models out there, but one of the models I work with comes out of the work of Kurt Leland, where he identifies 8 subtle bodies in addition to the physical bodies for a total of 9 bodies. And so you have, kind of the etheric body, the astral body, the causal body, mental body, buddhic body, and so forth. And it seems that certain experiences involve different bodies. So if you're in your astral body, you're going to have certain kinds of experiences and you're going to go to certain astral realms. If you're in your causal body, those are different realms. If you're in a buddhic body, those are different realms. So one of the things, and I don't know if our research is going to be able to kind of answer these questions, but I'm hoping that our research is going to help me think about and kind of ask better questions around this topic to better understand which kinds of subtle bodies seem to be associated with which types of experiences. And then that might start to point to an understanding of some of these experiences are occurring in the causal realm and the buddhic realm and the astral realm, or whatever labels we might use for those different dimensions or worlds. But that is kind of where I'm headed in terms of the relationship between consciousness and reality and how they interface. I find that to be the most exciting because I feel like we need a much bigger cosmology, kind of a subtle worlds cosmology that interfaces with our current kind of quantum physical world cosmology. So I think that's kind of that's the $1 million question, Alan. You've asked it.
That's a very interesting area, and we've done some. In fact, we just released, I think, yesterday, an old interview from the original Thinking Aloud series with Saul Paul Sirag on hyperspace, and the mathematics of hyperspace are very well worked out, including geometrical transformations that occur when you go from one dimension of hyperspace to another. And it has always intrigued me as to whether there's any isomorphism or mapping that can take place between the very elaborate mathematics we already have of hyperspace and the experiences that people have. For example, oftentimes people report in a dream being chased by something bad, and you're running and you're trying to escape, and then it's as if you're caught in quicksand. You can't move. You're stuck. And people report that when that happens, that's when, if you have the presence of mind, you can start to fly in your dream.
Right. Yeah. Wow.
So that would be an example of a transformation from one state to another that I think we should be able over time to begin to map out those sorts of things.
Yeah, and if you look at the 3 books by Robert Monroe, right, that he wrote, in succession, that basically, and Kurt Leland provides a version of this analysis in some of his work, but essentially the first set of adventures that Robert Monroe has out of body are occurring in his first book, are essentially in his etheric and astral body. Then in his second book, most of the adventures are really him getting out of those bodies into his other higher bodies, of kind of the, mental and causal bodies. And then his third book, the adventures there seem to be more about the Buddhic and higher bodies, right? So it's also kind of a developmental, even evolutionary process, right? There's more than one body to get out of in a sense, right? Or to get into, right? So we could talk about in-body experiences as well as out-of-body experiences, right? Depending on kind of what spatial metaphor you want to use, right? So, and in our interview process in the second phase, we'll be asking questions to help clarify which body people are in, because I'm developing a map of the bodies and the experiences and kind of the markers of when you're in one body versus another. And so that'll be part of the interview process so that we can get more of a sense of like, when are they in an astral body versus a causal body, right? Because there's certain things that are associated with one or the other, right? And so that can help us kind of get more clarity.
Yeah, it's so interesting using the term body, right? Because we have this, what we perceive as a physical body, and how we frame it and everything. It's wonderful because it continues to evolve and refine. There's a question here from LA who says, hello all from Portland. Sean, could you please note research databases on extraterrestrial studies, their strengths and limitations for us grad students? Gratitude, heading your way.
Great. Thanks, LA. And you mentioned Portland. I went to college in Portland, Oregon. I love Portland, Oregon a lot. And now I live basically in Portland, Maine. So I love both Portland. So whatever Portland you're from, big thumbs up, because Portland's awesome. Yeah, we have UAP hearings on Wednesday, right? Another round with 4 witnesses. That should be interesting. I think, the extraterrestrial question is like, kind of how I got into all of this a number of years ago. I'm very fascinated by it. And, a big part of exo studies, is kind of aimed at the UAP and NHI, domain. I often don't even use the word extraterrestrial because extraterrestrial kind of comes out of essentially a materialist paradigm, right? It just assumes these flesh and blood beings that are from a planet far, far away. Now, I absolutely believe that there's good evidence to suggest that, that is part of what's going on, right? So it's not like that. But there's so much more that's going on. I taught a course, a number of months ago called Exoterrestrials. And we looked at the top 10 hypotheses as to who are these beings that are, flying these so-called craft. Right. And so we looked at, crypto-terrestrials, extraterrestrials, all these different categories, of these different types of beings. And for most of those categories, there seems to be good suggestive evidence that we need to take it seriously. Right. So I think the category of extraterrestrial is actually like kind of a meta category. And there are 6 to 10 different types of major categories within that. And then when we look within that, there seem to be hundreds of different types of extraterrestrials or exoterrestrials, to use my term, that people are encountering. And if you look at the free research, right, that was done by Ray Hernandez, who's been on New Thinking Aloud, that research was very much a big part of the inspiration for me doing the super experiencer research, because in that research, they documented that people were having a wide range of encounters with different types of non-human intelligences, most of which were positive. About 30% were more of kind of a negative or scary kind of interaction, but 70% were positive. And this was a bit shocking to a lot of people because there was kind of this assumption that, when you encounter a non-human intelligence, it's just kind of a scary thing, right? Because it's just so different. And, but that doesn't seem to be the case. It seems like a lot of people have very positive experiences in that situation. And so part of why I'm focusing on the non-human intelligence piece as kind of a subset in this research is I really want to understand that aspect of our reality better, right? And it's interesting, like when you look at those different categories that I kind of, named at the beginning, right? Angels, demons, ETs, cryptids. Many beings can be described, like the same being can be described in a way that fits in many of those categories, right? So there are fairy beings that look like ETs, and there are ETs that look like fairy beings, just to give a quick example, right? So often the morphology isn't very indicative of which category, ontologically speaking, the being actually is part of, right? So this is one thing that I'm wanting to explore in the research. Is like people's description of the being or entity that they encountered. And then, because oftentimes they will describe it, they might then interpret it as an ET or a fairy. But if you actually just look at the description of what they've given, and without jumping to a conclusion, the description's somewhat neutral. It could either be a fairy being or an ET, right? But they're bringing that additional framework to the encounter, and they're assuming it's one or the other. And I've talked to a lot of people who say, yeah, ETs exist and fairies don't. Or I believe in fairies, or I've seen fairies a number of times. I know they exist. I don't think there are ETs, right? It seems like often we have a boggle threshold that only allows for one or two types of non-human entities, right? And then every other type is just kind of like, yeah, I don't think so. As far as I can tell, in terms of my experience and the research and talking to a lot of people, there are a lot of different types of beings out there. And we are in various types of interactions with them, right? And so I'm very interested in like, how do we get a better kind of even scientific sense of all of that, phenomenologically, dialogically in terms of encounters. So that's definitely, an area that I'm interested in because, a lot of times what people call an ET could just as easily be referred to by any number of other labels. So how do we actually determine whether or not it's an ET or a demon or a fairy or a Sasquatch, right? People report seeing Bigfoot, flying UFOs, right? So what's up with that? It's just like, can it get any weirder? Like, I don't think so, but it does, right?
Right. And then the perennial question of the reality of it or the veracity of it, which is, how are you adjusting for that? Or is this just kind of exploration and then you'll get to that? Or
Right. So, a lot of this comes down to, like our cognition, perception, memory, right? Because the general move that's made is like, oh, yeah, people authentically believe or think they had this experience, but, it's just their mind, there's hallucination, it's just fantasy, right? In a sense, there always can be kind of that skeptical out. I think what I'm trying to do here with this research is like, and with the second phase, having, that set of psychometric assessments that basically, without a shadow of a doubt establishes these are just average normal people, right? Like there's no red flags here, folks. Like this is just average people. And then to show how many of those average normal people are reporting these kinds of experiences, so that we then have to say, okay, maybe it's fantasy, but maybe it's not, because why would so many people be having, similar kinds of experiences across, their life, like, so I think there's a lot that can be done that kind of forces us to take it seriously, even as we're holding it lightly, right? Because there are a lot of ways our mind filters phenomenon. We, cognitively, neurologically, culturally, like there's a lot of filters that any experience goes through, right? So we have to absolutely acknowledge that, become more familiar with that filtering process. There's a concept that I've developed in exostudies called mutual enactment, which is this notion that these beings, like to focus on the beings, these beings bring something to the party and we bring something to the party, and that we're mutually enacting each other, right? So absolutely there is a way in which we're seen is in part based on our projection or our expectations, right? So that's absolutely part of it in many cases. And many of these beings seem to have the ability to kind of tap into our memory bank or our expectations and then present themselves accordingly. So there's something about this kind of mind-to-mind connection that we're just beginning to understand of kind of how that plays. But that doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It doesn't mean that there wasn't an actually ontologically distinct being on the other side of that interaction. Even if there's layers of cultural conditioning or cognitive filtering that's going on, right? So that's part of exo studies, is to try and honor and acknowledge all the layers of filtering, but say at the end of the day, there still seems to be a there, right? There still is something going on. And so how can we say something about that? What can we and can't we say about that? And so this kind of research is not probably going to answer that question to the satisfaction of many diehard skeptics. But my hope is that this research is going to move us in the right direction, right? And it's going to be validating to the people who have these experiences. It's going to help bring down the social taboo by recognizing the ubiquitous nature of this phenomenon, and that it can allow us to then build on that, and do more research, different kinds of research, that can get at some of these more specific issues.
Yeah, and people do describe, I'm in this camp, and I know Jeff is, and I'm curious, Sean, in a moment to hear about maybe some of your experiences where we've had precognitive information, or like in Jeff's case with his uncle Harry at the time of his passing, where, right? And so, and then also, I don't know if your research will be exploring this, but it could be interesting to look at what impact or impacts does it have on people's lives? And is it helping their lives or hindering their lives in some way? I know for me, it's definitely enhanced my life. And yeah, so is that something you're exploring with this research, or you have, or?
Totally. Yeah. And I think that's one of the angles to help normalize the phenomenon is because the research to date that's been done on that question does tend to show a positive impact on people's lives by and large. I mean, and there are exceptions, and that'll be something we want to look at. But when you can show that people are healthier, happier, as a result of these kinds of experiences, by and large, then that helps, kind of normalize it and say, okay, like, there's something here. This is useful. This is interesting. People get a lot of meaning out of these kinds of experiences. And yeah, I've had several very powerful precognitive experiences that just kind of rocked my world, and, kind of just like, so, and so we want to understand with each kind of experience that people have, like as a super experience, let's say you've had 10 major experiences over the last 20 years. Which one of those were the most impactful and why, right? And so trying to understand some of the patterns within the full range of experiences that people have, just to better understand, because sometimes there's an acclimation process where the first few experiences kind of rock your world, freak you out, isolate you. You don't want to talk to anyone about it, right? Or maybe challenge your worldview. So there can be, difficult, right? But then often as people kind of acclimate to it or start having additional similar experiences, then it can become a really positive experience, but so we want to understand that dynamic is, which people is it just positive and stays positive? Which people does it start out kind of rocky, but then becomes positive? And which people does it start out positive and then for whatever reason kind of goes south and gets rocky, right? Like, cause some people might have really powerful experiences, in their, young years, and then end up having a poltergeist experience in their 20s that was really disturbing, right? So there are good and bad experiences here, and that is something we want to understand, and help kind of figure out how to support people having these experiences.
Sean, are you
Go
able,
ahead.
are you willing to share, Sean? Thank you, Jeff. One of your experiences that maybe you haven't already shared on New Thinking Aloud, or maybe even someplace else, or whatever comes to your mind?
Yeah, happy to share always. Most experiences I've shared at one place or another over the years, so there might not be anything new, but there was a very powerful experience I had, with a woman where I was in my 20s. We were traveling in India, and we became romantically involved. And on the first night that we were together, I had just a precognitive experience, a very what I call a moment of clarity. I've had 3 moments of clarity that were all precognitive and all became true. This one basically was 2 things. One was she had been sexually abused as a youngster. She did not know it, and she was gonna discover that, realize it, remember that, sometime within the next 6 months. So that was the first piece. The second piece was she and I were going to travel together to New Delhi, right? So those were the 2 hits I got. Never had an experience like that. It was like, I wrote it in my journal. I didn't say anything to her, and I was kind of like, I was curious, like, is this going to play out? There were several moments in our travels together where, like we were in Varanasi at one point. The next morning, she was going to leave for another city, and I wanted to stay in Varanasi. So I in my mind, in my journal, I was like, all right, that one prophecy is not happening because she's packed her bag. She's leaving in the morning, and I'm staying, so it's not going to happen. Then she like went to the train station, and the trains were all on strike or whatever, and she came back, and we like stayed traveling together, right? So there were a number of moments like that where I thought it was not going to happen, and then it did. Similarly, when we got to New Delhi, the plan was for us to continue to Dharamsala. So I thought, okay, here we are in New Delhi, but we're going to Dharamsala, so this thing's not going to happen. And then I forget the details, but she ended up staying in New Delhi, and I went on to Dharamsala, right? So then that came true, and then I was wondering about the other piece, and then she ended up coming to Dharamsala, like a month later, reconnecting with me. We're hanging out, and I was aware that, based on our conversations, that this information hadn't yet kind of reemerged in her awareness. So then, I said goodbye. I went back to the United States, and then I was living in Portland, Oregon, and I'm sitting there in my kitchen, and email had just kind of emerged. Like I had a Hotmail account, so I'd had a few interactions with her via email, but I hadn't been in touch with her for like a month or so. I'm sitting there, and this dark energy, this like dark being, enters my body, and I hurl over. I'm crying. I'm in a lot of somatic, emotional, psychological pain, and I'm having this very clear, strong sense that this is her pain. She's just realized what's happened, and it was too much for her to process. And because of our soul connection or our entanglement, that pain has come to me and is being processed through my body mind system as a way of helping her move through it in some sense. And so it lasted for like 2 minutes, which was a long time for that kind of experience. And then I emailed her like that day or the next day and basically said, hey, something interesting happened to me yesterday. I'm wondering if anything interesting happened for you recently. And because the internet at the time was like you had to go to a little cafe and pay some, rupees and dial up. And, so I think I heard back a couple of days later, and she wrote back and said, yeah, I just realized that I was sexually abused when I was young, and I'm having all these memories flooding in, right? So that was a very powerful kind of precognitive experience, that had kind of several layers and occurred, over, basically. And at that point, it was basically 4 months, right? My insight was it was going to be within 6 months. So it was within that time frame, right? So that's one of about a dozen crazy experiences I've had.
Yeah, that is amazing. And maybe somehow have you interpreted that in any particular way, or just it's an experience? Like, do you have any assessment of that experience for yourself?
Not really beyond kind of what I shared, that it was like because we had a connection, maybe even a soul contract of sorts, where I agreed to connect with her in India, on travels, and maybe be part of, you know, I think because our relationship was a very loving, kind of safe relationship. So there might have been a way in which that helped create a space for this to come forward.
Yeah.
So, I think there's a soul layer, maybe, who knows, karmic. But it's, and this is a good question, because I think a lot of times we really want to make meaning out of our experiences, and we kind of jump to interpretations. I've had different interpretations at different points over the years, and I always try and hold them lightly and just gather more data, more insight, more maturity on my part, right? And so that's one thing that I would just offer to everyone who, has these kinds of, anomalous and noetic experiences, that whatever your current interpretation of it is probably true but partial, and that just keep opening to new layers of revelation that experience might provide, right? And kind of once we lock into a particular narrative, it tends to short circuit the fullness and the mystery of what that was actually about.
That is great advice. Yeah.
So there's a question here from BC Clarity Carlton Martin, who asks, and this is a unique term, I haven't heard it before. What is euphoric overload? And she adds, or he adds, I sometimes feel like I am going to lose consciousness.
Yeah, so I've not heard that phrase, euphoric overload, but just based on the etymology of it and just kind of I'm sensing it's just like this an overload of kind of, feeling euphoric and just being, really good, expansive experience. I mean, Kundalini experiences in a sense are kind of an example of, in some cases, of euphoric overload, right? Or just so overwhelmed with bliss that, you kind of, lose consciousness or pass out, right? And many of the saints, like Saint Teresa of Avila, right? We can think of, as an example of that euphoric overload. Yeah, that's intense, right? And I think it's an example where sometimes even a very positive experience, or what kind of initially starts out as a positive experience, can become so intense that it kind of flips over into kind of a painful experience, right? And we know that too with people who have been tortured, like prisoners of war, where the pain that's being inflicted on them at certain points can flip over into kind of bliss, right? Ironically, right? Because you're at the edge of somatic and emotional psychological experience. And so sometimes this trauma transcendence thing can happen. So beyond that, I don't know, I don't have much else to say or offer, but I think it is it is an experience that is described by many.
Mm-hmm. I just want to mention that we've got less than 30 minutes. It's so fun to hear you speak, Sean. I feel like the time is just flying by. We're in no time zone. There's been a few questions, and I know you mentioned the website earlier. If you could just tell our listeners and viewers how they can be involved in your research project.
Yeah, so a few ways. One is, the superexperiencer.org website. So www.superexperiencer, all one word, .org. That's just a microsite for now. It has a description of the project, an overview of the advisors, just named listed there, and then the pilot survey. So people can, and you can also sign up to get, the kind of newsletter announcements of updates, right? So you can either do that, or if you also want to fill out the pilot survey, even if you've just had a couple experiences, I encourage you to do it just as a way of being involved and contributing to our data set. It's all anonymous, so that's really important, and it kind of explains that on the site. So there's that. There's also, the program. You could become a master's or doctoral student at CIHS working with me. Students are directly involved with this project. And, as I mentioned, the 12 students in the class I did last spring, helped identify the 10 categories. And then they generated what ended up being almost 500 questions for the big survey. Now, when people hear that, they're kind of like, oh my gosh, like who's going to fill that out? Well, you would only have to do all 500 questions if you had experiences in all 10 categories, right? In the sense that it's a dynamic survey where if you tick, 3 or 4 of the boxes, like, yeah, I've had experiences in these areas, then you're going to get a subset of questions asking more details about those experiences. So if you only have, a few boxes ticked, you might just have, 50 to 75 questions. If you tick a lot of boxes, then yeah, it's going to be a longer survey, but we're going to design it so, people can do it over several sittings, right? So you could actually be involved with me in helping to, develop the different phases, to analyze the data, so that's always a possibility as well. And then I teach courses through my public platform on, Institute of Exo Studies. And so you can go to exostudies.org and see the courses I have coming up. The one I'm teaching in the new year in January is on varieties of non-duality, right? So some courses I do focus on exo studies, anomalous experiences. Like I taught a course recently on 10 different types of entity encounters. I also mentioned the course on the 10 different types of UAP hypotheses. And then sometimes I do stuff, around more contemplative experiences, because I'm very interested in both, right? The noetic and the anomalous experiences. So those would be the three main kind of websites and ways to connect with me and reach out to me. But yeah, email me. Would be happy to connect.
And by noetic, that's ways of knowing, or how would you define that for those who are maybe
Yeah,
not that term?
yeah, great question. Yeah, so noetic is kind of refers to kind of experiences of like knowing in a sense, like gnosis, right? And so they generally it's used to refer to kind of contemplative experiences, unity experiences, experiences of non-duality, experiences of merging, right? So like powerful transpersonal experiences that in many cases don't have an anomalous component. But many anomalous experiences are noetic, and many noetic experiences are anomalous, right? So again, whenever you kind of put a stake in the ground with a term, you're just kind of opening yourself up to the examples that don't fit into that definition. But I often will use noetic to kind of refer to kind of the experiences that come out of the mystical traditions, and anomalous to refer to more the things that seem kind of weird and kind of throw the pull the rug out from under us. Though powerful mystical experiences can do that as well.
Blow your mind stuff.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And your world.
And yeah.
Well, speaking of having your mind blown, Vincent Regance from Organic Hypnosis Training asks, what has surprised you the most about exploring this stuff?
Yeah, I love that question. Thank you, Vincent. It's a couple of things that I've touched on, but it's great to have a chance to kind of underscore this. One is how many people have are super experiencers, essentially. Like I thought initially that this was a more uncommon reality, that not necessarily a lot of people had a wide range of experiences over the bulk of their life. But I'm finding that that's not the case. I'm finding that lots and lots of people have a lot of different weird experiences and noetic experiences, in many cases, kind of throughout different periods in their life. So that's been very exciting to me. It's just kind of like, wow, like we really do live in a wild cosmos. We really do. We are like interdimensional, multidimensional beings. Like, wow, like this is like common. Like this is just like, and I think because we live in such a materialist, secular, scientific, cultural, that we just like, even if we believe in psi phenomena, even if we believe in other entities, like we just kind of assume that it's happening, but kind of on the low, right? Some people have those experiences, but not many. It seems like when I start talking about my experiences with people, so often they start telling me about theirs. And I found that the more I'm willing to come out and share my experiences, the more people say, yeah, I had this thing happen 10 years ago, and it's like, wow, it's like, oh yeah, now we're talking, right? So I think just the ubiquitous nature of these experiences has been really surprising. And then the other thing has been around, doing the deep dive around entity encounters. And one, kind of realizing that, there are 10 to 12 major categories. And then within each of those categories, there are 10 to 50 different types of beings that have been documented. So just the variety, kind of like the, biodiversity, if you will, of entities and beings, has been really surprising to me and exciting again, because it's like, wow, we are just surrounded by all kinds of different forms of intelligence, and there's a lot of different ways we can interact with and all those beings. And again, like some of it's scary, some of it, can be overwhelming, but it's like, walking down, the wrong streets in a big city, it can be scary here, right? So it's like, it's not like this world is without its, kind of fear factor, right? So I think that's part of it, is like developing our own kind of embodied sense of being in these experiences, developing the discernment, and learning to trust our experiences, because we're taught at such a young age basically to not trust ourselves with these experiences, our own noetic and anomalous experiences. So I do a lot around self-gnosis, like how do we validate and verify these experiences for ourselves? And it doesn't mean just because you have the experience, you just assume like it's true, right? No, there's a whole process of kind of discerning and clarifying and holding it lightly, right? Like even powerful experiences I've had, in years past, sometimes I'm still holding them lightly and go, I don't know what to do with that. Like, I don't know what that experience was, right? Like once I had this experience of being a mantid being helping to fly a craft, and that the mantid being, the experience I had was that they were several thousand years old. And as a result, it felt like it both was a past life of mine, a current life of mine, and a future life of mine, because this being is going to live longer than, Sean Esbjörn-Hargens lives on this earth, right? And so what do I do with that? Like, do I literally just assume like, yeah, I have a parallel life as a mantid being? Maybe, maybe I do. Like, that's an interesting consideration. Like, wow. Or maybe there's a connection with that being. So maybe I just had a merging moment with that being and kind of mistook it for myself in a sense, right? But even that's amazing. Like, wow, there's a being out there that lives that long and is flying that ship. That's cool. Or was it just a delusion? Maybe, like, yeah, I have to remain open to that. Like, or maybe just a certain set of neurons fired at the wrong time and I had that experience. Absolutely could be the case. I find it more interesting to be open to the possibilities of what that was, right? Without, even though part of me wants to nail it down and go, was I that being or not, right? I find it more interesting to go, yeah, it's a weird world. Who knows? It's like, so like staying in that kind of epistemological openness, that ontological openness, I think in a sense is like a skill, right? And I think it's, a capacity that we want to develop more as a way of helping us hold just the bigness of these experiences, because they're big, they're life changing, and they really can kind of throw you for a loop. And you don't talk about these things over with polite company. Oh yeah, I wonder if I'm a mantid being. Like, yeah, you just don't go there in general speaking.
Well, you said well, I'm grateful for your openness, and I think that we have a question that kind of parallels some of this, that perhaps that openness might impact people having these experiences. So this person's name is translated to the Latin alphabet would be Tonger Burhan, and they ask, do you think that every living being has the potential for psychic powers at the level of the PK man, for example? Jeffrey Mishlov's
Right.
studied Ted Owens. His name of the book is the PK man, who was able to, Jeff, well, here, let me ask the question, and maybe Jeff can tell us a little bit about the PK man. This person says, I do not see many PSI researchers talk about the infinite potential of everyone. And Jeff, do you want to share a little bit about Ted Owens briefly? So for those who may not be familiar with your great book.
Well, I can say that the same questioner also referred to Nina Kulagina, who was a Russian woman known for extraordinary macro psychokinetic abilities, which are quite rare. And I think, just speaking for myself, I'm pretty sure everybody has a certain amount of psychic ability. But there, like with any other human talent, there are going to be people who are extreme. And Ted Owens, who I wrote about in the book, The PK Man, PK standing for psychokinesis or mind over matter, was a person who demonstrated over the years. I have records of 160 some demonstrations of what he takes to be macro psychokinesis. So the question to you, Sean, is how accessible are these extreme abilities?
Yeah, great question. So I think there's two ways in which those extreme capacities are available. Either people have developed those kinds of capacities in former lives, so there's like a karmic element, so they're coming into this life and they've already kind of built up that capacity, and it's just kind of a matter of kind of reactivating that ability in this particular incarnation, right? So I think there's something about karma to be said. I think most people who have those extreme abilities, they most likely did not start at ground zero, in this incarnation. The other thing is that you can develop many of these capacities in extreme ways, through dedicated practices and meditations, and again, I think someone like the PK man, I'm inclined to think, because he just started having those capacities without necessarily doing a bunch of practices, that he kind of came in with, that, so to speak. But, a lot of, lamas and rinpoches and the Buddhist tradition, like they document that if you do these practices, you develop these cities, you develop these capacities, and you can do it in one lifetime. Right. So I think it's a matter of talent and or, developing it and putting time in and practice. But I do think all of us, as Jeffrey mentioned, all of us have a multidimensional embodiment where we have access to some psychic capacities. And then this is what I love about Kripal's work around the superhumanities and his notion of being superhuman, right? Because he's also advocating that this is a birthright of all of us. We all have this. It's just part of being human. It's part of being in a body. It's part of having subtle bodies and being connected to the larger energetic realities around us, right? But we've just lived in a secular culture for so long that we're just really out of touch with that. But I think, Dean Radin's work, Michael Murphy's work, Future of the Body, I mean, there's some real pioneers that, really highlight that, these are just, innate human capacities. I mean, Mike Murphy's work is interesting because a lot of athletes, like professional athletes, extreme athletes, develop profound psychic abilities because they're developing extreme levels of concentration and focus and so forth. So to me, that's an example of being able to develop these extreme abilities in this lifetime just because it's a dedicated part of your kind of day-to-day training and your competition and, the events that you're part of, right? So I think there's through training, you can go really far. And then obviously through, prior training in past lives, kind of coming in karmically can, give you an edge, if you will.
Yeah, we had Dr. Rick, he goes by Rick Leskowitz on, and he made a documentary film on the Boston Red Sox called The Joy of Sox. And he was looking at the features of why they were so successful, what they were doing, and looking at also the impact of the fans and collective consciousness. And it was interesting because of course, many of them describe getting into the zone, which is, not new, but it was interesting because one of the players actually said that they were feeling love from the fans and that they felt like they were getting in a flow of love. And I'm just curious if you have any comments on that term, love.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think a lot of this is about love, right? And I think, like just for like if thinking about poltergeists are very scary for most people, right? When they have that kind of experience in their house and they're seeing entities and things are moving and then often it seems that the phenomenon or the beings that are involved with that are intentionally making things scary to create fear because that's creating an energy source for them, right? So there's that whole kind of frame and approach. People like Paul Eno and Bob Faulkner and others have pointed out the best way to deal with that is not an exorcism, it's love, right? It's to cultivate and bring love and kind of shower love at the phenomenon or at the beings that are terrorizing the house. And that usually like very quickly, like within days, like it like evaporates, right? Because the love energy has kind of, broken through kind of the fear dynamic. So I think that's just one example that love has a bigger role to play in a lot of this than we often realize or give credit. And I think it's a really cool example of this, baseball player experiencing the love from the fans, right? In that flow state. And especially when you get into big collectives like that, and then you can even talk about egregores and other phenomena too. So there's bigger layers of kind of non-visible reality that might also be in play in some of that. But yeah, absolutely. I think love is something that should be explored more in this context. So I'm going to think more about like how might we explore that in this research as kind of one of the sub hypotheses or questions that we're looking at. Like, what's the role of love in all of this? So thank you for mentioning that.
Yeah, because many think, and I'm in this camp, that that's possibly one of or the primary or the way that we are all interconnected. And I just want to add too, in his documentary, for those who are Boston Red Sox fans and maybe other places where a lot of intention and energy is created and cultivated, that many people think of Fenway Park as a sacred space, a sacred place.
Yeah, when I think places like that becomes sacralized, right? Through intention, through fan joy, through because what makes something sacred in many ways is just a repeated quality of positive intention, right? And so that's a ritual space, right? The ritual plays out there over and over again. So, I think, and I think that's why partly sports are so big in the US is because they're one of the places we can go to a place like, Fenway Park, and we experience the sacred, right? To come back to Jay Paul's question, right? And in some ways, that's sometimes the only place we might experience the sacred in today's kind of modern, lifestyle. So absolutely, I think we should think of those as sacred places that are becoming power spots, right? And over time.
Yeah, a lot of joy and love and fun, which, good old fashioned fun is sometimes in short supply. So yeah.
Here's a viewer whose YouTube name is It Just Happens, who is asking about the funding. How hard is it to get funding for this sort of research? We know you're getting some support through the California Institute for Human Science, but are you able to attract outside funding, considering that this is a 6-year program with some very ambitious projects in the later stages?
Yeah, great question. It just happens. The first 2 phases are being funded by CIHS and myself and some anomalous donors that have contributed to it. And, so, we are going to need more funding. And so that is part of the process is generating that. I think the third phase is going to be the most expensive when we get into, kind of the medical research, the, brain scans, brainwave stuff. And so the plan is I'm going to be putting together the plan for, securing that funding over the next couple of years. Because as you mentioned, like I have a little bit of a runway here by design. And part of the approach is to really make sure phase 1 data and phase 2 data is really good and really interesting, because my feeling is that the stronger the research is at the first 2 phases, the easier it's going to be to generate and pull in the right partnerships to fully fund the third phase. And if the third phase needs to be spread out over some additional years because the funding kind of comes in and, in different batches, then so be it. But we're going to get there. But yeah, it's going to take a lot of effort. But like any good project, there's a lot of great support around it. So it's just a matter of getting it all lined up.
Funding is never particularly easy when you're dealing. In fact, even in mainstream research, it's very competitive to get funding. But certainly in the paranormal field,
Right.
funding is more difficult.
Yeah. And this is why, by being partnered with CIHS and with our labs, like we can do a lot of this in-house, so that's helpful, right? But yeah, there is going to be a need for, a good size of funding, especially for phase 3.
Well, we're getting near the bottom of the hour. Perhaps before we close the interview, we'll give out for people who are interested in your research, the website once again for the Super Experiencers Project, and any other links that you'd like to share with people. We will also, of course, add them in the description of the video.
Yeah, great. So there's the, www.superexperiencer.org to see the overview of the project and participate in the pilot survey. There's just going to www.cihs.edu for the university, and then you can easily find the Integral Noetic Science program there. And then there's my personal platform, the Exo Studies Institute. So www.exostudies.org. So any of those 3 places, you can find a way to contact me and connect.
And it's worth mentioning, if you get on the CIHS.edu website, in addition to noetic sciences,
Yeah.
there's the transpersonal, integral, and positive psychology track
Yeah.
there. And that's where the parapsychology
Right.
programs, which are brand new, are currently embedded. So CIHS has, in effect, several departments exploring the transpersonal, the sacred, the paranormal from different perspectives, and yet overlapping and mutually supporting.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we have an integral health program and we have a clinical psychology program. So yeah, there's a lot of great programs and they're all informed by kind of a consciousness first orientation, right? So all the programs kind of take this bigger picture view, body, mind, spirit kind of orientation. So yeah, come check us out and let us know what questions you have about any of the programs.
And I also like that there's the positive psychology aspect, because so many, for better or worse, psychology programs focus on the pathology and putting people into
Right.
labels. And I know that's, Jeff, something that when you were starting out as a psychology student, you wanted to study the positive forms of human deviance versus the negative forms. And that also maybe some way, if we are focusing on the positive, then people might actually have more positive experiences. And I really hope and would love it if the work that you're doing and so many others can really manifest into those. I have a bachelor's in psychology, and it was just a little paragraph on these topics many years ago. This was 30 years ago, but it was sad to see, and it wasn't really encouraged, and it was just sort of brushed aside. So I'm glad that you're making the efforts that you're doing. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, and I'll just say, Dr. Glenn Artulis, who's the program director of the Integral Transpersonal and Positive Psychology program that Jeffrey was mentioning, is a real pioneer and leader in this space, right? And so he's done a lot of great research around, transpersonal and positive psychology, and he's an amazing, he runs the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology, and so yeah, we have a great team at CIHS, and amazing people running each of the programs. So yeah, come check us out. And we're happy to support you developing skills in these areas professionally.
Yeah, and helping people realize that whether it's a super experiencer or a smaller experiencer or whatever, but that maybe it's all normal, and that these are all aspects of ourselves we can embrace versus feel ashamed of or fearful of, and so forth.
Yeah, and I'll just, because it was asked what I was most surprised by, and it kind of taps into that. So I'll just say this quickly as we're wrapping up. When I first started teaching my exo study courses a number of years ago, I mostly just wanted to teach courses that were looking at UFOs from a lot of different perspectives. And it was just kind of like a chance for me mentally to explore all these possibilities. But what started happening in the first class was people started sharing their experiences. And very quickly, the class kind of turned into like a support group of sorts for people just express all their anomalous experiences. And so my whole orientation changed from kind of like intellectually interested in this to really wanting to be an advocate for people who have these experiences, because I saw firsthand that many of my students or participants in those first classes had a whole bunch of different experiences, and that space that I created was one of the few places that they ever shared those experiences. And I was just like, wow, we got to change this, right? We got to take the shame away. We got to talk about these. These are powerful, amazing, confusing experiences, and we need to explore them together. So that was like kind of the big shock for me, was kind of shifting from kind of intellectually curious to like kind of a heart-based opening of like, wow, all right, let's hold hands and let's figure this out together.
Yeah, how beautiful. Definitely.
Well, thank you so much for being with us today, Sean. It's been a
Yeah, my
great
pleasure.
pleasure. Thank you, Emmy, for
Thanks,
co-hosting
Emmy.
with me.
My joy, my pleasure. And thank you, Jeff. Also, Jeffrey Mitchell, for the many years you have given in this area. And it's beautiful to see it continue to blossom and unfold for all of us.
And of course, special thanks to all the viewers for being with us, because you are the reason that we are here.